In the shadows of paradise, where million-dollar hotels touch the clouds and forgotten people live stacked on mountains, one man became invisible royalty. His name was whispered, never shouted, and for years, he was untouchable. Rio de Janeiro, a city split in two. On one side, Copacabana's golden beaches stretch beneath luxury towers where the wealthy sip champagne and watch the sunset. On the other side, rising like a wound against the sky, stands Rocinha, the largest favela in Latin America. Over 100,000 souls crammed into a vertical maze of concrete, wires, and corrugated metal. No street names, no addresses, no rules, just survival. This is where Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopes was born in 1989. Not into wealth, not into privilege, into the forgotten Brazil, where the government arrives only with bullets and arrests, never with schools or hospitals. His mother worked cleaning houses down in the rich neighborhoods. His father was a ghost, gone before the boy could remember his face. Little Antonio grew up watching, always watching. He saw how power moved through Rocinha, not through politicians or police, but through men with guns and bags full of powder and crystal. The favela had its own laws, its own kings, its own economy built on stuff that came from Colombia and Bolivia, stuff that flowed like water down the mountain and into the veins of the city below. And young Antonio? He wasn't big, he wasn't loud, he wasn't the type you'd notice in a crowd. But his mind was a steel trap, recording every face, every deal, every weakness. In Rocinha, being invisible was the greatest power of all. At 13, Antonio was already running errands for the local traffickers. Small jobs at first, carrying messages, watching corners, learning the rhythm of the trade. The favela was controlled by a patchwork of gangs, each fighting for territory, each claiming to protect the people while bleeding them dry. But Antonio didn't align himself with the loudest or the strongest. He watched for the smartest. By 15, he was trusted with money. By 17, with product. By 19, he had earned a nickname that would become legend. Nem. It meant not even in Portuguese, as in, not even there, not even visible. The name fit perfectly. While other traffickers wore gold chains and threw parties, Nem moved like smoke. He didn't need to be seen. He needed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The early 2000s were a war zone in Rio's favelas. The Red Command, Comando Vermelho, and the Pure Third Command, Terceiro Comando Puro, were tearing the city apart, fighting over territory, over supply routes, over respect. Bodies dropped daily. Police raids came like hurricanes, random and destructive, killing innocents along with criminals. And in the middle of this chaos, Nem was learning the most important lesson of all. Control is not about violence, it's about information. He built a network. Street kids became his eyes. Moto-taxi drivers became his messengers. Shop owners became his bankers. Grandmothers sitting on their stoops became his early warning system. He knew when police were coming before they reached the bottom of the hill. He knew which officers could be bought and which ones were true believers. He knew which rival dealers were loyal and which ones could be turned. Knowledge was his weapon, and he was building an arsenal. By 2004, Rocinha's leadership was fracturing. The old boss, Lulu, was losing control, paranoid and violent, making enemies faster than he could kill them. The favela was unstable, and instability was bad for business. Nem saw the opening, but he didn't storm in with an army. He didn't declare war. He simply waited. And when the moment came, when Lulu's own people turned against him, Nem was there. Quiet, organized, ready. The transition was almost silent. One day Lulu was in charge. The next day he wasn't. No grand announcement, no celebration. Just a shift in the air. A new understanding spreading through the narrow alleys and staircases of Rocinha. Nem was the one in control now, and he had a vision. Most traffickers ruled through terror. Nem understood something deeper. You can't tax the dead, and you can't sell to the terrified. He wanted Rocinha to be stable, predictable, profitable. He established rules. Dealers couldn't rob residents. Disputes were settled through him, not through bullets. Women and children were off limits. Break the rules and you disappeared. Not publicly, Not dramatically, just gone. Quietly, efficiently. He restructured the drug trade like a corporation. There were departments, security, distribution, accounting, enforcement. Money was counted daily. Shipments tracked meticulously. Workers paid on schedule. He even established a HR department of sorts. Dealers who got addicted to their own supply were fired and sent to rehab clinics Nem secretly funded. A healthy, loyal workforce was more valuable than disposable soldiers. The stuff flowed in from connections in São Paulo and beyond. Powder from the Colombian cartels, crystal from makeshift labs in the interior, pot by the ton. But Nem didn't just move product. He moved it smart. He diversified. He laundered money through legitimate businesses, small restaurants, taxi services, internet cafes. He invested in the community, not out of kindness, but out of strategy. A prosperous favela was a loyal favela. By 2007, Nem wasn't just a trafficker. He was the de facto governor of Rocinha. While the official government pretended the favela didn't exist except as a problem to be solved with police raids, Nem was solving actual problems. Garbage piling up. He organized collection crews, streetlights broken. He hired electricians, disputes between neighbors. They came to him, not the police. He held court in a modest house in the middle of the favela, protected by layers of security that seemed invisible, but were everywhere. Armed lookouts on every corner, radios crackling with updates, escape routes mapped and memorized. The Brazilian police had millions in equipment and training, but Nem had something more valuable. The loyalty of 100,000 people who saw him as their protector, not their enemy. The money was staggering. Estimates put his operation at moving over 200 kilos of powder per month, each kilo generating tens of thousands of dollars in profit. Crystal moved faster, cheaper to buy, easier to sell, wildly addictive. Pot was the bread and butter, steady and reliable. All told, Nem's organization was pulling in millions of dollars every month. And unlike flashy criminals who bought mansions and sports cars, Nem stayed in Rocinha, lived modestly, and reinvested in his empire. He built a parallel government. There were taxes, but they were predictable and reasonable. Protection fees from businesses, percentages from independent dealers who wanted to operate in his territory. In return, he provided real protection. Rival gangs didn't dare enter Rocinha. Thieves from outside were caught and punished. The favela became one of the safest places in Rio, if you followed the rules. But Nem's genius was in his invisibility. Journalists came to Rocinha and they never saw him. Police raided, and he was always 3 steps ahead, vanished into the maze of streets and safe houses. The authorities knew his name, knew his reputation, but they couldn't pin him down. He didn't give interviews, didn't pose for photos, didn't brag. While other drug lords built cults of personality, Nem remained a ghost, and that's what made him so dangerous. What made Nem different from every other trafficker was his understanding of systems. He didn't see himself as outside the law. He saw himself as running a parallel government that was simply more effective than the official one. And in many ways, he was right. When heavy rains caused landslides in Rocinha, killing dozens and leaving hundreds homeless, the government response was slow and bureaucratic. Nem's response was immediate. Emergency shelters set up in hours. Food distributed within a day. Rebuilding started within a week. The residents of Rocinha didn't see a criminal. They saw the only person who gave a damn whether they lived or died. He established a code of conduct for his soldiers. No robbing residents ever. No rape ever. Anyone caught violating women or children would face swift, brutal justice. These weren't the rules of a saint. These were the rules of a smart businessman who understood that oppressed people rebel, but protected people stay loyal. And loyalty was everything. His security network was legendary. Every entrance to Rocinha was watched. Cars coming up the hill were noted and reported. Strangers were identified within minutes of entering. Police vehicles were spotted miles away, giving Nem and his lieutenants time to scatter, hide, or prepare. He had radios, encrypted cell phones, and most importantly, human intelligence. The grandmother who noticed the cop in plain clothes, the kid who saw the undercover car, the taxi driver who overheard the raid planning. The Brazilian authorities were fighting a war, but Nem was playing chess. Every move they made, he had already predicted. Every raid, he was already gone. Every informant they tried to plant, he had already identified and turned or eliminated. The police had badges and guns. Nem had the mountain itself. Between 2007 and 2010, Nem was untouchable. His empire ran like clockwork. Shipments arrived on schedule. Money flowed up the mountain and disappeared into legitimate businesses across Rio. Politicians, though they'd never admit it, benefited from the stability he brought to Rocinha. A peaceful favela meant fewer headlines, fewer scandals, fewer embarrassing questions. He expanded his influence beyond drugs. Illegal cable TV services, pirated internet connections, unlicensed transportation networks, all paid tribute to Nem. He wasn't just the drug kingpin of Rocinha. He was the king of an entire underground economy, employing thousands, feeding families, providing what the government wouldn't or couldn't. And still, he remained invisible. Police offered rewards for information leading to his capture. 50,000 reais, then 100,000, then more. Nothing. No one talked. Because in Rocinha, there was an understanding. Nem protected his people, and his people protected Nem. The code of silence wasn't enforced through fear. It was maintained through loyalty. He moved through the favela freely, not with armed convoys, but with quiet confidence. People greeted him respectfully, but not obviously. He'd stop and talk to elderly residents, ask about their grandchildren, make sure they had what they needed. He attended community soccer matches, not sitting in some VIP area, but standing with regular people. This wasn't a performance. This was strategy. The best security isn't guards with guns. It's a population that sees you as one of their own. The stuff kept flowing. Powder to the wealthy neighborhoods where lawyers and businessmen snorted away their stress. Crystal to the working poor who needed to stay awake for double shifts. Dope to the addicts in the city center. Pot to everyone. Nem wasn't responsible for demand. He was just the most efficient supplier. And efficiency, he believed, was a kind of justice. Better him, who brought order and stability, than some violent psychopath who'd burn Rocinha to the ground fighting for control. But invisibility, no matter how perfect, can't last forever. By 2010, Brazil was preparing for the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016. The world was going to be watching, and a massive favela ruled by a drug trafficker 3 miles from Copacabana Beach was an embarrassment the government could no longer ignore. The pacification program was launched, Unidades de Polícia Pacificadora, or UPP. The plan was to occupy the favelas, drive out the traffickers, and establish permanent police presence. It sounded good on paper. In practice, it was a war. And Rocinha, with its strategic location, its size, and its symbolic importance, was a prime target. Nem saw it coming. He'd been preparing for years. Escape routes, safe houses, loyal networks stretching across Rio and beyond. But the government was preparing too. And this time they had international pressure backing them. They had funding, training, political will. The old playbook, raid, retreat, repeat, was being replaced with something more permanent: occupation. In November 2010, the police made their move. Thousands of officers, backed by armored vehicles and helicopters, stormed into Rocinha and the neighboring favela of Vidigal. It was the largest police operation in Rio's history. The message was clear. The age of the favela drug lords was ending. But Nem wasn't in Rocinha when they arrived. He was already gone, vanished into the network of safe houses and supporters he'd spent years cultivating. The police occupied the favela, set up checkpoints, arrested dozens of his soldiers. But the king himself? Still a ghost. For the next year, Nem lived in the shadows of his own city, moving from house to house, never staying in one place more than a few nights. His empire was crumbling. With Rocinha occupied and his lieutenants arrested or scattered, the money stopped flowing. The power that had seemed so solid was revealed to be as fragile as mist. The police were relentless, chasing every lead, squeezing every informant, cutting off every avenue of support. But here's the thing about ghosts. They're hard to catch. Nem had spent his entire life being invisible. And now, it was the only thing keeping him alive. He changed his appearance, cut his hair, wore glasses, dressed like a regular working man. He moved through Rio in plain sight, just another face in a city of 6 million. The government offered bigger rewards. The media painted him as a monster, a threat to public safety. the embodiment of everything wrong with Brazil. But in Rocinha, people told a different story. They talked about the stability he'd brought, the protection, the care. Some even said things had gotten worse since he left. The police were brutal, corrupt, and they didn't even pretend to care about the residents. At least Nem had been one of them. For a year, he evaded capture, living like a fugitive in his own city, cut off from his family, his power, his purpose. But the net was closing. Informants, motivated by money or threats, were starting to talk. Safe houses were being raided, allies were being arrested. The police were patient, methodical, building a map of his network, closing down every possible hiding spot. November 10th, 2011, a routine roadblock on the highway between Rio and São Paulo. Police were checking cars, looking for drugs, weapons, illegal goods. A large SUV approached, tinted windows, nothing obviously suspicious, but something caught an officer's attention. Maybe it was the driver's nervousness. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was the inevitable conclusion of a year-long manhunt. They pulled the vehicle over, ordered everyone out, and there, dressed in simple clothes, looking like any other Brazilian trying to travel between cities, was Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopes. Nem, the ghost who'd ruled Rocinha, the king who'd built an empire on invisibility. They found him in the trunk of the car, hiding like a common fugitive. No dramatic shootout, no final stand. Just a quiet, anticlimactic end to one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in Brazilian history. The man who'd commanded an army, who'd moved millions in product, who'd been untouchable for years, was arrested on a highway, hiding in a trunk. The media went wild. Photos of Nem, finally, photos, splashed across every newspaper, every TV channel. The invisible man was visible at last. The government celebrated it as a massive victory in the war against organized crime. Politicians gave speeches. Police officials took credit. The story went international. Rio's drug lord captured. But in Rocinha, the reaction was mixed. Some were relieved, hoping the attention would finally bring real improvements to the favela. Others were angry, feeling like they'd lost the only person who'd ever protected them. And some just shrugged, knowing that Nem was a person, not a system. And that the system, the poverty, the abandonment, the drug trade, would continue with or without him. Nem's trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors brought forth evidence of his criminal empire, the drugs, the money, the violence. Witnesses testified, some willingly, some clearly terrified, even from behind the shield of legal protection. The prosecution painted him as a ruthless criminal who'd held a community hostage through fear and intimidation. But the defense told a different story. They brought residents of Rocinha who spoke of Nem's fairness, his protection, his care for the community. They argued that he'd filled a void left by a government that had abandoned over 100,000 people, treating them as problems to be contained rather than citizens to be served. They didn't deny his crimes, but they provided context that made people uncomfortable. What do you expect people to do when the government treats them as less than human? In 2013, Nem was convicted on multiple charges: drug trafficking, criminal association, money laundering. He was sentenced to over 30 years in prison. No possibility of early release, no deals. The message was clear. The era of drug lords ruling favelas was over. The state was reasserting control. But was it? In the years since Nem's arrest, violence in Rio's favelas has actually increased. The UPP program, initially successful, has been plagued by corruption, brutality, and lack of funding. Many of the pacified favelas have fallen back under criminal control, just with new, often more violent leaders. The stuff still flows. The powder, the crystal, the dope, the pot. It all still moves through Rio, just through different hands. Nem sits in a federal prison now, cut off from the world he once ruled. No more empire, no more power, just time, stretching endlessly ahead. But his legacy remains complicated, challenging, uncomfortable. Was he a villain who exploited his community? Or was he a symptom of a system that created conditions where criminal organization was more effective than government? The answer, like most truths, is probably both. Today, Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopes is serving his sentence in a maximum security federal prison. The invisible king is now hyper-visible, monitored 24/7, every movement recorded, every communication monitored. The man who once commanded an empire now lives in a concrete box, measuring maybe 80 square feet. No tunnels to escape through. No loyal army to break him out. Just silence, routine, and the slow crushing weight of decades still to serve. But in Rocinha, his name is still spoken. Not with fear, not even with reverence, but with something more complex: memory. People remember the years he was in charge as a time of relative peace, of organization, of someone, even if he was a criminal, actually giving a damn about what happened to them. They remember that under Nem, you could walk the favela at night, that disputes were settled without bloodshed, that there were rules, and rules meant safety. The stuff still moves through Rocinha. New dealers, new organizations, new kings trying to fill the void. But none of them have managed to replicate what Nem built. Because Nem understood something that most criminals don't. Power isn't about being feared. It's about being necessary. He made himself necessary to Rocinha, and in doing so, he became more than a criminal. He became infrastructure. The Brazilian government touts his arrest as proof that no criminal is beyond the law. And they're right, technically. But they miss the larger point. Nem didn't rise to power because he was evil or ambitious. He rose to power because the conditions in Rocinha created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Take down one Nem, and the vacuum remains. Another will rise. Maybe not as smart, not as invisible, not as strategic. But someone always rises. Nem's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, poverty, and the role of government. In a functioning society, people don't turn to drug traffickers for security, for justice, for infrastructure. They turn to the police, the courts, the municipal services. But what happens when those institutions are absent, corrupt, or hostile? Rocinha existed for decades as a city within a city, home to over 100,000 people. And for most of that time, the government's only interaction with it was punitive. Police raids, arrests, violence, no schools, no hospitals, no investment, just containment. Is it any surprise that people created their own systems, their own rules, their own leadership? Nem was a criminal. That fact isn't in dispute. He trafficked drugs that destroyed lives, that fueled addiction, that contributed to misery far beyond Rocinha. He ordered violence against rivals and traitors. He built his empire on stuff that kills. There's no romanticizing that reality. But he was also the only form of governance that most Rocinha residents had ever experienced that actually worked. He provided safety, stability, dispute resolution, emergency aid, infrastructure. He did what the government should have been doing all along. Does that excuse his crimes? No. Does it explain his power? Absolutely. The real villain in Nem's story isn't Nem. It's the system that made Nem possible. It's the decades of governmental neglect that allowed favelas to become city-states unto themselves. It's the corruption that made criminals richer and more powerful than the police trying to stop them. It's the inequality so vast that millions of Brazilians live literally on top of a mountain overlooking paradise, but can never touch it. In certain corners of Rocinha, if you know who to ask, you can still hear stories about Nem, how he used to walk through the favela like a regular person, how he helped this family or that family, how under his rule, things made sense, had order, had a kind of justice, even if it was criminal justice. These stories are told quietly, carefully, because nostalgia for a drug trafficker is dangerous, politically incorrect, uncomfortable. But the stories persist because they represent something real. A time when someone, even if he was a criminal, treated the people of Rocinha like they mattered. The stuff still flows through Rio. The powder into the nostrils of the wealthy. The crystal into the veins of the desperate. The dope into the arms of the addicted. The pot into the lungs of everyone. The war on drugs continues, as futile and endless as ever. Traffickers are arrested, and new traffickers take their place. Favelas are pacified, and then they slip back into criminal control. The cycle repeats, generation after generation. And somewhere in a federal prison, Nem watches time pass. He's in his mid-30s now, with decades still to serve. The world he knew, the empire he built, the power he wielded, all of it is gone, as insubstantial as the nickname that defined him. Not even there. He became a ghost by choice, to protect himself, to maintain power. Now he's a ghost by force, erased from the world he once ruled. But his story remains, a complicated, uncomfortable reminder that the line between criminal and leader, between oppressor and protector, between villain and hero, is not as clear as we'd like to believe. In the forgotten places, where the government has failed and the system has collapsed, monsters do rise. But sometimes, those monsters are the only thing standing between chaos and order. The Rocinha Nem knew is gone. The UPP occupation changed everything. Armed police now patrol streets where his soldiers once stood watch. The drug trade continues, but it's fractured, violent, unstable. Multiple factions fight for control, and the residents, the people Nem claimed to protect, are caught in the crossfire. Some argue this proves Nem was never really protecting anyone, that his order was just another form of oppression. Others argue it proves the opposite, that for all his flaws he provided something the government couldn't or wouldn't: functional governance. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Nem was self-interested, violent when necessary, and built his empire on human suffering. But he was also strategic enough to understand that sustainable power requires buy-in from the governed. He couldn't rule 100,000 people through fear alone, not for years, not invisibly. So he gave them something: protection, justice, aid, attention. Things the official government should have provided, but didn't. His organization was a mirror held up to Brazilian society, reflecting all its failures. The poverty that pushes people into crime, the corruption that makes crime profitable, the inequality that creates parallel worlds within the same city, the governmental neglect that allows criminals to become more effective administrators than elected officials. Nem didn't create these problems. He exploited them, certainly, but he didn't create them. They were there long before him, and they remain long after him. Who was Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopes, really? Behind the legend, behind the nickname, behind the empire, who was the man? By all accounts, he was quiet, thoughtful, strategic, not given to outbursts of violence like many traffickers, not flashy or egotistical. He didn't need to prove his power. He just needed to maintain it. Those who knew him described someone almost boringly normal. A good listener, observant, patient. Not the kind of person you'd expect to build a criminal empire, but that's exactly why he succeeded where others failed. The flashy criminals, the violent ones, the ones who needed everyone to fear and recognize them, they got caught or killed. Nem understood that true power is invisible, that the most dangerous person in the room is the one you don't notice until it's too late. He had a wife, children, a family he protected fiercely, keeping them separate from his criminal life as much as possible. He knew the darkness of the world he inhabited, and he didn't want it touching them. It's a strange contradiction. A man who built an empire on drugs and violence trying to shield his own children from that same reality. In prison, he's reportedly quiet, compliant, no trouble. He reads, exercises, serves his time. No escape attempts, no dramatic incidents. The ghost is finally, completely, contained. And perhaps that's the saddest part of his story. That all that intelligence, all that organizational ability, all that leadership, it was channeled into crime because crime was the only avenue available to a poor kid from a forgotten favela. What could Nem have been if he'd been born 3 miles down the mountain in Copacabana? If he'd had access to education, opportunity, legal channels for his ambition? Would he have been a successful businessman? A politician? A community organizer? We'll never know. Because the accident of his birth determined his path, and the path led here. To a cell, to decades of confinement, to a life defined by what might have been. Some men are born in paradise and never leave. Some men are born on mountains looking down at paradise and spend their lives trying to reach it. But a few build their own paradise in the forgotten places, ruling kingdoms the world pretends don't exist. Nem didn't conquer Rocinha. He became it, invisible, powerful, and impossible to kill. You can cage a man, but you can't cage the system that made him. And somewhere on that mountain, in the maze of concrete and wire, someone else is already watching, learning, becoming the next ghost.